thank you for the warm introduction. It's obviously difficult to follow the remarks of Dr. Santon, who, of course, is not only a leading figure in the world who's done so much, but you can see the way in which he has digested and conveys so much that's happened in the world and is still happening in the world. Aside from that powerful poem, his reference to empathy. And I'm struck right now that a number of governments and politicians are actively opposed. You may know there's a movement in parts of the United States of America to actually stop teaching, obstructing teaching empathy, so that it's wrong to teach empathy. I'm not exactly sure what the intention is to replace it with. This is an idea. I noticed that the Secretary of Defense in the US is very, very excited about lethality is the word he's using of American soldiers. Both my parents were in the armed forces because they grew up. My mother was born still during the First World War. They lived through the Depression. They lived through the Second World War. Both were in the Second World War, different parts throughout the Second World War. And my understanding from many people in the military and defense and security around the world is that their first objective is to avoid war. And the investment is to find ways of living together that allow us to resolve or at least manage conflicts in such a way that war becomes unnecessary. And you may know that one of the key principles of the United Nations Charter is the illegality of the use of force as a means of settling disputes. In fact, Article 33 of the UN Charter explicitly says, uses the word first, states shall imperatively resort to a list of different means of settling disputes peacefully, and may only use force in self-defense if actually attacked, or the use of force collectively for purposes of the United Nations and no other reason. So yes, it's very troubling where we all now. Let me add a few words of welcome here at the Human Rights Research and Education Center and for the Alliance of Genocide Victim Communities, also Joanne and Makeda for your efforts and others. I'd like to just quickly recognize also the efforts of my colleagues who partly were here yesterday, I think helping, unable to be here today. They live far out of Ottawa, and so they have not taken the risk, but I know that at least one of them is online right now. Let me also thank those of you for being here. I want to also immediately acknowledge what's going on right now as we're sitting here. So not only we see in our news feeds the earthquake in Myanmar, but also the Southeast Asia region and the devastation and the suffering as the junta continues to bomb, actually during the earthquake and targeting even humanitarian efforts. Let me also acknowledge ongoing genocides. There are several of them in the world right now, and not only ongoing genocides, but really what I'm going to talk about, which is those who are at risk of genocide, because there are many more of them that we are not paying attention to right now. And by the way, this includes Indigenous peoples here in Canada and in the United States of America, I'd like to underline, based on what is happening south of the border in the last few months in particular. And finally, I think in this connection, it is imperative that we not forget not only genocides, but the causes and the conditions which have given rise to these kind of failures of humanity. For several years, I had the pleasure and the honor to assist as an editor of a journal called The Holocaust in History and Memory. And it's very important that it's in history and memory, because it's not only a matter of identifying and historically citing the antecedents, kind of getting the record right. I'll say something about this later. But I think the idea of memory, which is a human experiential a function of being, we have memory. We have memory individually, but we have memory collectively, socially, within groups. We now even talk about intergenerational memory. There's even efforts to look at this at a genetic level as sentient animals. How do we through generations retain both the good and bad of this? and the kind of breadth and the character of it, which we need to study more so that we understand how to actually stop these things and prevent them. Dr. Stanton mentioned quite a bit about Rwanda, and he said, it was preventable. And President Clinton still claims that it was the greatest single failure of his presidency. Kind of shocking if you think about his presidencies and all the things he could identify. He said he laments that they did not intervene. Of course, he was in a position to intervene, so we could discuss that in more detail. But Dr. Stanton was saying, well, the information they had the months ahead. I was working at the United Nations at that time in Geneva, and we had the mechanisms. This is something else I want to talk about. How can we respond? We had some mechanisms, and specifically the UN Special Rapporteur on summary arbitrary executions. At that time, a Kenyan lawyer, no, not Kenyan, sorry, not Sierra Leone, Senegalese lawyer, Wali Bakr Najai, who had worked with the International Commission of Jurists. He was the UN Special Rapporteur, and he had gone 1 year almost to the day. He had gone to Rwanda in the light of what was going on with the worsening situation between the communities. And he had published, I should say he went earlier than that, and he published almost a year to the day in 1993, the spring of 1993. He presented to the UN Human Rights Commission, as it was then, a predecessor to the Human Rights Council, his report, and he actually said there's going to be a genocide. So this idea of the preventable genocide, we could not have had a more kind of informed clarion call that something had to be done. So all member states of the United Nations were fully informed. This was debated at the Human Rights Commission. So the idea that, it somehow only filtered to a few people in the military and elsewhere, this is a pure nonsense. Because as I'm going to talk about now, the kind of duty to prevent, what were we supposed to be doing? And one of the arguments that's often advanced to you, and I want you to reject it out of hand now, is this idea that if only we knew. I want you to, if you hear that, stop whoever says that immediately and just declare bullshit. We know all the time. We have abundance of information. We have telecommunications now that give us real time what's going on in Myanmar right now, but what's going on also last week. You can see it on your little, amazing devices, which are very problematical. But the idea that we don't know, we know. We know in precise detail. We know in real time. We know also the contributing factors to the conditions. We know who is responsible, more or less, individually and collectively. So we can talk about what should be done, but the idea that if only we knew somehow blocks us from acting must be rejected out of hand. We know. Correlated to that, if only we knew implies something, then we would do something. What is that something that you think you'd all do if you only knew? Because I'd like to argue that there's a lot of things you can do right now. And the whole idea of prevention is you don't need perfect knowledge. There's an old saying, the good should not be the enemy, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. This holds true very, very much here. We don't need perfect knowledge. We need sufficient knowledge. And we have abundant, sufficient knowledge about what are the risks of what, and you do this all the time when you drive your car. You don't perfectly know you're not going to have a car accident, but you make sure that the tires are filled with air and the oil has been checked, and you buy. Who here has house insurance on your house? Are you really going to have your house, destroyed by fire today or next week? No, but there's a risk, and you take steps to address that risk. So we live this way all the time. It's one of the features of the human species. Is we know things about our past and our present and our future and the trajectory of these. So we are always engaged in risk analysis, risk assessment, and so forth. So the one of the greatest threats to our societies, to ourselves, that has been given this title of genocide, this word, we absolutely know, and we can foresee, and we can act. So I want to put these ideas together. Now let me say a few things quickly about genocide as such. and how I approach this in terms of a professor and a jurist and a practitioner. So first, let me just say that this notion of genocide, which, as you know, was coined by Raphael Lemkin, is an, I'll put it in simple terms, as much as the idea archetypically, we have some, I would say, a shared clarity. We talk about the Holocaust in this country because of the Ukrainian diaspora. We talk about the Holodomor. We talk about a lot of such cases. We heard about Rwanda. Now in Canada, we talk more and more about Indigenous peoples in Canada and genocide, different kinds of genocide, and so forth. We have a vision, we have an idea, we can imagine what we're talking about. I want to underline that, to my knowledge and professional experience, no two genocides are the same. Each one is unique. The specific causal linear progression or non-linear progression to the kind of roots and the results are not identical. They are always contextually specific and unique. And so not only I don't think it helps, as Joanne said, to get into these discussions. However, as humans, we compare all the time, and we have to compare as one of the devices we have in terms of reasoning to be able to see or specify what are those recurrent elements that contribute, for example, to risk assessment, and what are those things which are effective. We heard from Dr. Stanton, for example, prosecutions of persons who may be individually responsible. So we can generalize, but we do so understanding that no two situations are identical. And not only that they are not identical, but that when we look at these situations, we also know that there's an evolving idea. And so, for example, in our country, there's a dispute ongoing, whether, for example, with regard to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, is that a genocide? Was it a genocide? Is it still now a genocide because it's still ongoing? We see on our news efforts to investigate missing women in Manitoba, for example, and so forth. I want to suggest to you that the way in which we respond to that is by having mechanisms, having an approach, having empathy, among other things, and that it behooves us to engage rather than to a priori exclude or suppress or close the door on the prospect. Let me add further that in doing so, I think that there is the contribution. Dr. Stanton has an unusual combination in his professional background of being an anthropologist and a jurist. Many jurists have no such background and are not that very sympathetic or understanding of what he's talking about because they don't have an anthropological or sociological background. And the core of genocide is the destruction, in whole or in part, of a group, but a group of humans that are not incidentally. I mean, we are a group in this room. It's not the incidental character of us being in the room or in a single spot. It's about, and it's explicitly stated in the Genocide Convention, the character of that group. It's national or religious or ethnic or attributed race and so forth. So it's something about that sociocultural character that is that must be the focus of our concern. In the Genocide Convention, and here's where for me as a jurist, I begin for a effective approach, which is what I hope to leave you with. I begin with the Genocide Convention of 9th of December 1948. And I begin with that from a perspective of what we call positive law. So we can have all sorts of ideas of the thoughts, the origins, the moral and other elements contributing to this, to the abhorrent character of what we understand and have archetypes about genocide. But from a legal perspective, our starting point is the Genocide Convention. And this in positive law means things which are as a matter of sources of the legal system. Here I mean international law, a treaty, an element of customary law, or a general principle. The prohibition of genocide is not a general principle of international law. That would be something like good faith, for example. There is an argument that genocide is prohibited under customary international law, which means that the community of states, this is a Westphalian statist paradigm of equal states, that they recognize this norm, and they share the idea that they are obliged, legally obliged, to respect it. And there are not many entities, certainly not many states that I'm familiar with, who actively say they're in favor of genocide, even if they are genocidal. So I think there's an argument to be said for that, but it doesn't give us much specificity or utility in practical terms. So the Genocide Convention is a treaty, and it's articulated in 9 short. If you haven't read it, just read it, because there's a lot of people who tell you it's very complex and the ideas are going to confound you. It's not. It's one of the simplest instruments I've ever read in international law. It's 9 short substantive provisions, articles. Each one is even short. So it's not like lengthy and complicated. The ordinary meaning of the words are pretty clear. Anyone can read them in any language and you'll understand it. And I'm choosing my words ordinary meaning because we happen to have in international law another treaty called the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which tells us how to interpret a treaty. So if you're a little bit confused, or even a lot, there's another treaty you read, which tells you how to read this treaty, and that makes it really clear. And so one of the things the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties says is to interpret a treaty, you read its ordinary meaning of the words, their structure, where they locate it, and taking into account the motivations. There's a long set of explanations of how this treaty was elaborated. So we can look at, they often use the French terminology, travaux préparatoires, the preparatory works. So we know what the intent of those words are. And we can look at its subsequent application. But the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties also says any interpretation which yields a manifestly absurd result can't be the right one. So this relates to what Dr. Stanton was saying. When some jurists say, oh no, you can't do anything, we don't know anything about prevention until after a genocide has occurred, that's manifestly absurd. You don't have to be a jurist, you don't even have to be an adult. I had 3 kids, they know what, if you tell them don't put your hand on an element of a stove, you don't wait until they've done it before you actually do anything to prevent them from doing it. You make sure the stovetop is turned off. You do things because you can foresee. So the Genocide Convention is not complex, is what I want to tell you. And if you read its specific provisions on prevention, it's really, really clear. And it's Article 1. It says the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, so it doesn't matter when it takes place, is a crime under international law, which they, meaning the state's parties, undertake to prevent and to punish. Now, to prevent and to punish, those are 2 separate things. You punish, who do you punish? You punish those who are the perpetrators. That requires identification of the specific actors. It may be the state, that's a bit more complicated. It usually means individual natural persons who led in government or led in, you don't have to be government, individual non-state actors, individuals. So an individual human being, and only an individual human being, can be tried or prosecuted. A state cannot be prosecuted, for your information. A state can be brought to a court, International Court of Justice, that's to determine right or wrong in a dispute, but you don't prosecute because you can't arrest the state. You can't put the state in jail. I mean, all the basic principles of natural law don't apply to a state. And a state's a very powerful thing. But you can still pursue a state. The state's duty to prevent, well, you see, this is a very important point. The state has a duty to prevent. You and I individually don't really have capacity individually to prevent. I mean, how would I prevent, let's say, even you, if you wanted to commit genocide? Am I now going to personally arrest you? And this is very problematic. We need the state. So the primary duty of prevention is the state's duty. And part of that prevention in the treaty, by the way, under Article 5, I believe it is, it says that contracting parties undertake to enact, in accordance with their constitutions, the necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the present convention, in particular to provide effective penalties for persons, meaning natural persons, guilty of genocide or any other acts that are prohibited, incitement, conspiracy, and so forth. So the state must make it domestically in Canada, for example, illegal to engage in genocidal acts or to plan and then you can individually be prosecuted. The state's failure to do that is a failure of what's called state responsibility between other states. Go back to Myanmar. It's not clear to me, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Myanmar has not enacted legislation in Myanmar to make it illegal to commit genocide under the criminal code. We have in Canada. There's a provision of the criminal code. You should all know this now. It is illegal in Canada. You can be arrested, tried, and put in jail for all of the acts constituting genocide in Canada. Is anyone being tried for it? Pretty darn rarely. There are people alive today who did participate in acts relating to Indigenous peoples in Canada that have a character of genocidal breach. To my knowledge, they've not been tried. That's an interesting question. Why not? We have the means. We have the devices. I can suspect some reasons why they might not be tried, because they're going to put in their own defense explanations, possibly of complicity of state actors or state institutions that facilitate it, fund it. For example, you may not know, we're sitting here in the University of Ottawa, and Makeda made an acknowledgement of Indigenous lands and so forth. The University of Ottawa was the largest, religious order connected with the University of Ottawa ran the largest number of residential schools in Canada. I think 54 was the number. So this university here, where we're standing right now, directly implicated, actually actively engaged, not on their own, absolutely with the participation of the government of Canada. So that would suggest complicity to what has been called genocide, acknowledged as genocide, even by, for example, our previous prime minister, who, with regard to missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, when the commission on them announced in an adjunct report that there are breaches of the Genocide Convention, Justin Trudeau immediately said yes. He was ahead of our government. So the government of Canada acknowledged there was, and arguably still is, to be determined, an ongoing genocide. But why has nothing been done about it? When we know that people are still living today who are directly implicated on the government and on the private side and institutions alike. So now, there are 153 states to the Genocide Convention today. That's 3/4 or more than 3/4 of all the states in the world. And what that means for a state that is a party, if it has signed the convention, it means it cannot do anything contrary to the object and purpose. So it must be doing a lot of things that are in the spirit, like Dr. Stanton said, the spirit of justice, the spirit here of prevention and prohibition and prosecution of genocide would be to do a lot of things, adopt legislation, create institutions, create the conditions where genocide should not occur. But if you have ratified the treaty, which most of these states have, then you are subject to a lot more specific, rigorous obligations and potential recourses. And specifically, Article 9 of the Genocide Convention not only permits, it actually says in imperative language, I'll read it for you because it's good again that we read this simple treaty. It says that disputes between contracting parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the present convention, including those relating to the responsibility of a state for genocide or any other act enumerated, could be complicity, could be failure to prevent even, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties. Shall be. It doesn't say if you feel like it, if you want to get around to it. You know, the choice of language here is imperative. It shall be. And why shall it be submitted? Because it's also interpreted, if you read the basis of this convention in its preamble and in the resolutions for its adoption, elaboration adoption, because it was considered to be a threat to international peace and security. This is such a serious matter, that it has to be brought to the International Court of Justice for it to be adjudicated, for objective analysis, for careful scrutiny, and for responsibilities to be identified, including their implications, including reparation or injunctive behavior. In other words, orders of the court to stop behavior and so forth. In this period of time, now, almost 75 years, some 75 years since the convention has existed, there has only been a handful of cases ever brought to the International Court of Justice. But in the last 10 years alone, some 8 or 9 genocides, if you just Google Wikipedia and you just Google genocide, they list 8 or 9 genocides in the last 10 years in the world. So there's an obvious gap there. Like, why is nobody acting on this? And now we have a few cases. Until about 5 years ago, we only had 2 cases ever. Amazing. Now there's a handful, but now there's a lot of disputes about these disputes. How is it used? Is it abusive? Should we obstruct efforts to stop the International Court of Justice from acting and making it actually difficult to implement this treaty? And that leads to what Dr. Stanton was arguing, that one has to ask questions about the actual intent or effectiveness of the overall regime. Is this actually intended to be an effective regime, or is it actually intended to be a kind of aspirational notion? Another thing I would underline here is if you do look at the identified, by the way, if you look at Wikipedia for actual genocides, they don't mention Indigenous peoples in Canada or anything, not even mentioned. So it's acknowledged by a Prime Minister of Canada, and they don't even bother to mention it. That's pretty remarkable, right? Because some of the other ones they mention are highly disputed, but they mention them. Why do they mention? What's their criteria, by the way? Very strange criteria. Sometimes they put, for example, number of people killed. Genocide Convention doesn't say a word about number of people. And in order to conspire or plan or incite, you don't need to kill anyone. Those are crimes, but you don't need to kill anyone. You could have wide conspiracy. That's what happened in Rwanda. Moreover, if you look at Article 2, which elaborates the 5 actions of genocide, only 2A is killing. So can you cause serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group constituting genocide without killing? Of course you can. In fact, it's very widely done. There's nothing that says unless you kill someone, there's been no genocide or no harm. But for sure as heck, it doesn't say there's a numerical threshold. It doesn't say 10 constitutes genocide, 100. Our compatriot, William Shabas, probably one of the most renowned genocide scholars in the world, some say the most, he has said, in my view, patently, ridiculously, that there is a minimum threshold of 10,000 deaths. Where he got that from is Mars. I don't know where he got it from. But just for you to understand the idiocy of that remark, the Sami in Finland number less than 10,000 people. So according to his criteria, you can wipe them out entirely, but you never commit a genocide because you need 10,000. And for those of you who've done a little bit of math, you might know about the notion of relative scales. So 10,000 amongst 100 million might be a small number, but 10,000 in a small group, as I just mentioned, could be the whole group. So where is this 10,000 coming from? What's the point of it even? But this is the way in which we're behaving. Instead of just reading the text, understanding what the implications are and what we need to do. Now, I don't have time to go through. There's a lot to talk about in terms of specific elements of prevention, but I want to draw to your attention a few. So Dr. Santa mentioned that very often actually war, different kinds, civil war, armed conflict. There's very few wars technically in the world. There's one right now between Ukraine and Russia. The history of the world in the last century and these days, we have more armed conflicts, different kinds than have been since probably the Second World War. Most of them are within the state and many of them are relatively so-called low level in the sense that not like Ukraine, Russia, not bringing heavy artillery. There's a lot of those, but a lot of the armed conflict is lower level. This is an evolution of the forms of violence and state and non-state actors. But there is nothing which associates or precludes necessarily genocide with such a condition. If we look at the case of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, there's not a war, there's not an armed conflict. There hasn't been an armed conflict in Xinjiang or in China in a long, long, long time. That's not what's happening. But there's an awful lot of evidence, if you read the Genocide Convention, which China does not deny, it's a state party to. It doesn't deny that these are the provisions that apply. It just denies it's doing it. It denies the facts, or even doesn't deny the facts. It denies the interpretation of the facts and certain attribution. But nobody's arguing that there's a war in Xinjiang. So, or Tibet. So just to say that that is not a necessary prerequisite. However, we need to know that where wars or armed conflicts do occur, there has historically been a tendency for incidents of genocide. Because it's often been said, war is the absence of human rights or the absence of humanity even. And there's more scope in the context of wars, even legally, that states are granted more scope to take measures which can weigh upon or diminish respect for human rights and so forth. So there's more opportunity, let me put it that way. And historically, they have coincided, the Holodomor coinciding and the Holocaust with the Second World War or with extreme repressions. But if we talk about prevention, we can't wait to be looking at war. We have to be looking way, way, way before this. So we have to look at what are the proximate or deep causes that contribute to the creation of conditions or create the conditions. And these, I think, revolve around very specifically the protected group, which is very often overlooked by jurists who are not anthropologists, which is a national, ethnical, racial, religious group. That's what is the subject of, or they are, the subject of protection. The raison d'etre of this convention is those groups. So what is it that needs to be done to actively protect, not to come post facto with some, men in black robes in The Hague adjudicating who did wrong after a group has been suffering genocide? That's not only too late, it's kind of stupid. So we need to look more specifically. And for this reason, efforts have been made to create mechanisms and norms that diminish the risks. This is all about risks. So things like the diminishment of arms availability, the early dispute resolution, when we see groups excluded, when we see targeting in social policy, when we see, and that's why Dr. Stanton mentioned, extreme nationalist, racist, not only rhetoric and policy, but specific laws, the instrumentalization of institutions, of force, the monopoly of force within the state. How is that used? Is it routinely discriminatory? Is it targeting? All of these things are the early parts of genocide. And we have to focus on them, not only to create proactively the means of preventing their abuse. So exactly on this logic, various institutions, one which was mentioned in introduction to me, I worked for many years for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, High Commission on National Minorities, the sole purpose of which was to prevent violent conflicts affecting minorities in a European context. They didn't say it explicitly, but it was a precursor to preventing genocides, because the historical link was when those things happen, they lead to genocide. So it was 2 steps earlier. It might surprise you that to this day, the High Commission on National Minorities of the OSCE is the only institution in the world that is dedicated uniquely to preventing armed conflict affecting minorities. There is no other such institution anywhere. We don't have one. That's kind of shocking. I was involved after the Rwanda genocide at the United Nations in creating the special advisor of the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. And the idea was to create such an institution that was targeted. You might know that the last special advisor was not renewed by the current Secretary General, basically for her failure to act. And we have, myself and colleagues have written about and analyzed, again, very late, very modest, a little bit of notation, but not proactively preventing, engaging with the responsible authorities, looking at their laws, looking at their institutions, and not only criticizing them, but mobilizing to change them. That involves a set of advisory and other assistance, but it also means using recourses. So we have now lots of treaty bodies that can look at the source of these. I'll give you one example. The Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So if extreme anti-racial conduct can lead to genocide, you'd logically want to pay attention to systemic or systematic racist policies because they could lead there. The Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which goes back to 1979, I think it was, I can't recall the exact year. Canada's been a party. It's one of the most ratified treaties in the world. Only last year, Canada brought a case against Syria at the, against Syria on the Convention Against Torture. But they never brought a case under the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Why not? Why not? This has been possible. We've had these opportunities. We simply have chosen not to use them. So it's not just the Genocide Convention. If you're bringing a case on genocide, you are really, really late. Why are we not using the institutions that exist earlier? Not only legal ones, there's all sorts of mechanisms, special rapporteurs, commissions, Indigenous Peoples Forum on minorities in the there's all sorts of places to go and things to do. Not enough, not as effective as we hope, but we need to use those that exist. So without going too much on about this, I have a few suggestions, which hopefully might be give some inspiration for this conference. What is it that you can do? What is it that we can do? And I have 5 suggestions. The first is, and thank you for, I'm sorry, I forget your name, the person who shared her testimony.
Lydia.
Thank you today. It is absolutely vital to maintain your testimonies and share them. I know it's very difficult. This is something that I would say that particularly the Jewish diaspora has done very well. They have created institutions, museums, and so this is my second recommendation, is not only to share them, but to document them. We need to do this actively because the forces, the dark forces, we know that evil occurs in darkness. The dark forces are trying to stop the documentation, erase. That's what's happening in the US right now, erasing historical basis of memory, and they prohibit it. So it's absolutely vital that testimonies be shared and that documentation is achieved. The evidence is compiled. That this can be through museums, through events, through activities, and now we have a lot more resources. We can do that online. It's not as difficult as it used to be. It used to be very costly and time-consuming. It's still time-consuming and so forth, but we can do it. My third recommendation is to use all available recourses internationally, but also domestically. Why are there not processes to identify and even prosecute? It will be difficult, but when you start, you place the burden on those who have to explain why they're not acting. What is the basis of this lack of political will, and so forth? And fourth, I believe we need to demand more and better international mechanisms, not only out of solidarity, but in terms of their accessibility. It shouldn't have to be so burdensome, the hurdles, the costs, or the time. My main criticisms of the International Criminal Court, but also the International Court of Justice, is crazy long periods of time that often result to very little effect. You might not know that the entire prosecutions under Nuremberg, 161, I think 190 persons prosecuted, 161 conventions, that entire convictions, that entire process took less than a year, I think 9 months. Entire process. How is it that a single prosecution at the International Criminal Court with 1,000 staff and millions of dollars takes 10, 15 years? How is that possible? That results, by the way, there's only been 14 successful completed prosecutions, 4 resulting in acquittals. So I really would urge that we need to be much more demanding, not only to have more mechanisms, more effort to pursue them, to mobilize and advocate in this regard, and to invest. You know, we should be, it's another problem I would say of the civil society and others, we are very modest and shy in our requests for resources. I say this even as a scholar and even as a part of non-governmental organizations. We're very happy if we get pennies or crumbs. Whereas, you know, Eisenhower correctly said, you know, that basically the peace movement has to hold bake sales. I mean, quite literally, if you come here during the week, you will see some of the student groups holding bake sales to help with pretty big issues, right? But we're talking now about not only 2% for defense, I think ironically titled, now we're talking about 5%. We're already talking global military industrial expenditures at the $2 to $3 trillion, not counting certain intelligence and other services. So we need to be a lot more serious about what we're asking for. And that brings me to my fifth proposal. We have an election going on in Canada right now. And why we are not asking, I mean, at least with regard to Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also with large diaspora communities and the effects in a complex interdependent world, why can Canada alone, without asking anybody, without any dependency on anything, at least create or name a dedicated mechanism or institution or person that deals with the prevention and prohibition of genocide? Can we not have an office? Even if it's a single person, you know, we created one called the Commission, the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, dealing with certain industrial activities. It took forever to create one office, doing some not bad things, maybe not enough. But why would we not have one on genocide? We have genocides in this country, and we have survivors, people here. So I would say if we can have one that has also a transnational understanding of the interrelationship, because it's not just in Canada, has a transnational mandate and is could be linked with within that mandate of a general public interest mandate of memory and history to help with the documentation, use our public resources to do this. Could be linked with the Archives of Canada or something like that, and that would be and that would proactively engage not only in Canada with our relations with other countries. There are all sorts of implicated issues. For example, property restitution, family linkages. This is the character of genocide is it is not a single act and it does not end with the act. It has a continuing dynamic. It exists through generations. So we need to have the resources. And I think this doesn't happen without naming and dedicating an institution, at least a person. And we can ask for that. And I think it would resonate in Canada with Canadians. And I think it's timely or overdue. And I would at least like to put it to the leadership of the political parties and say, what do they think about it? Because if they're going to say no, I want to know why. Because their international obligation is to prevent genocide, not only to deal with historical ones, but to prevent ongoing ones from getting worse or from erupting in the future. So those are my proposals for this meeting. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you.